an exhalation strategy can interfere with range of motion or enhance performance. So how are we cueing this? Good morning. Happy Monday. I have NeuroCoffee in hand and it is perfect. All right, very solid weekend. Rolling into a new week. Looking forward to a big one. Hope you are too. I was going back and forth on the Q&A email, askbillhartman@gmail.com, with Bryce. And Bryce had actually a really good question in regards to exhalation strategies and such, and when would we actually cue something that would be a much more of an aggressive exhalation strategy, so much like a Valsalva maneuver. And so it allows us to talk about several different things. We can talk about exhalation interfering, we can talk about exhalation as a performance enhancer, and we get to talk about sticking point stuff. So let's kind of break this down into those segments. When I started talking about archetypes and started influencing the different breathing strategies in regards to, a wide ISA is going to use a more forceful exhalation to close the ISA. The narrow is going to use a sort of lighter exhalation strategy because we don't want to over-recruit the external musculature. It started to seem like everybody that jumped on the bandwagon thought that there was only one way to do this kind of a thing. And so then that starts to create some interference, because you're going to have situations that come up where people come in with these superficial compressive strategies. These are exhalation-based strategies to begin with. And if you use the inappropriate exhalation strategy, even if it falls into that archetypical recommendation, you can still create some interference. So for instance, if I have a wide ISA that has a really strong superficial compressive strategy and I drive the hard exhale to try to close the ISA, you just reinforced everything that's interfering. And so we want to start to look at these things as the needs of the individual. So it's always N equals 1, as I'm fond of talking about. And so, for instance, in this wide ISA with a strong compressive strategy, you may have to just use simple, quiet nasal breathing, and you tend to get a really, really good response, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to take the strategies into consideration and then superimpose what is the best case scenario in regards to the breathing. When we look at the extreme other end, so when we get into this performance relationship, we have to use these really, really strong exhalation strategies, because we need high forces, and then we need the benefit of that force to actually demonstrate velocity. And so we're going to move people towards these Valsalva maneuvers, and so there's an element of timing and duration that will either enhance our ability to access these high forces, or are we going to create interference for speed. So if you've been living under a rock, a Valsalva maneuver is an exhalation against a closed glottis. So if you've ever lifted anything heavy and you made a little grunting noise, that prior to the grunt, which is the release of air, you did a Valsalva maneuver under those circumstances. If you look at the research and they talk about percentages of 1RMs, if you're a practiced lifter of any kind, you can actually inhibit the Valsalva maneuver up to about, give or take, 80% of your 1RM. At about 80%, it's going to become automatic, and you're going to need it, because at some point in time, you're going to have to reduce the relative motions to produce enough force to complete a lift. Under those circumstances, the thing that we want to recognize is it's not always going to be under these maximal effort conditions for most people. There's going to be a threshold that's idiosyncratic to that individual where they're going to need a higher force output, and therefore they will automatically hold their breath. Let me give you a strange for instance. So my dad would have this noise, this mighty yelp that he would give as he was getting out of his recliner. And number one, it was to announce the fact that he was actually getting up to leave the room. But number two, it was because the effort that was required for him to get out of the chair required that much of an exhalation strategy to produce the forces to get up out of the chair. So when we talk about the sticking point, we're talking about this high pressure situation that we need to produce. So when we're going to see these Valsalvas show up is going to be, there's going to be a joint position where they're going to typically show up. So it's typically going to be in these internally rotated, biased positions. So if you think about, as we talk about the sticking point at about 90 degrees of hip and knee flexion, plus or minus 30, it's going to show up in these ranges. So anytime you have to produce a high force under these circumstances, again, an IR bias, we're going to see this high internal pressure number one, be required, but it's probably not going to be easy to inhibit it under those circumstances. Now, if we take this into the training hall, number one, we might have to coach it to a certain degree. So under certain circumstances, when we want to reduce relative motions, or we're trying to train an element of performance. So for instance, if we take a narrow ISA who's biased towards an eccentrically oriented pelvic outlet, they might have too much yielding action, and we want to teach them concentric orientation, and we want to teach them overcoming. So we're going to have to train them to produce this forceful exhalation under these circumstances to actually acquire the internal pressures required to produce these high forces and high speeds. And so again, so if we're looking at a box squat, for instance, and we want to teach the impulse off the box squat, we're going to have to teach this brief, forceful exhalation strategy, because they may not understand it, they may not have it under those circumstances. We might also use it if we're, again, under the same circumstances where we're trying to impose some velocity on top of this to acquire this concentric overcoming. So if we did like a squat clean or something like that, again, we're going to cue these high force, brief exhalation strategies to help us produce force, but also to get the tissue behavior that we're trying to acquire. If we're trying to transition somebody from the slower speed strength training to demonstrating high velocity, we want to start to concern ourselves with the timing of the exhalation strategy. So in these circumstances, we're looking for a situation where we're actually producing the highest amount of tension, and we're creating the release strategy, which is where we're going to demonstrate our velocity, and then recapturing our tension again. So if we're doing some form of oscillatory impulse activity, like a split squat, or some form of rotational activity, now we're talking about strategy, because if we sustain the exhale through these activities, what we're going to see is we're actually going to see a reduction in the amount of velocity that we're going to be able to demonstrate, because an exhalation strategy is internal rotation, it is force production, and it's a reduction of relative motion. Well, we need this relative motion available to us to demonstrate the velocity. One other thing as a side note is you're probably going to want to reduce the total volume of slower speed strength training under these circumstances, because then what you're going to have is you're going to have this interference where in one aspect of training you're producing high forces and you're sustaining this exhalation strategy for an extended period of time, and in the other we're trying to shorten that duration, and so we've got a little bit of a conflict. So just a word to the wise in regards to your programming. That you can actually create interference if you don't pay attention to your loads and volumes. And of course, you're going to use some form of key performance indicator, whether that be some form of jump, sprint, or other high velocity activity. It could be just throwing if you're a baseball pitcher. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a background, a little bit of a framework to work with when we're talking about these exhalation strategies. Again, they can be interference, and we'll see this quite often in the rehab situations. So we got to be very particular about our exhalation strategies. But when it comes to performance, there's a timing and a duration that's going to be a very, very important influence in acquiring the desired outcomes. So if you have any other questions, please go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com, and I will see you guys tomorrow.